On a distant world, nearly 140 million miles away from Earth, a lone astronaut is left for dead. Abandoned by his crew after a deadly storm, stranded with no way to call for help, and running out of food, water, and air, his chances of survival seem impossible. But this is not the end of his story, it's the beginning of one of the greatest survival battles ever told. This is the story of The Martian, 2015. The movie opens with a team of astronauts conducting experiments on the surface of Mars. They carefully collect samples of its dusty soil, analyzing the planet's terrain. Suddenly, a powerful dust storm approaches, forcing the crew to abandon their mission and rush back to their spaceship. In the chaos, one of the astronauts, a botanist named Mark Watney, is struck by debris and lost in the storm. Despite their desperate attempts to contact him, the rest of the crew receives no response. Believing he didn't survive, they make the painful decision to leave Mars without him. But against all odds, Mark is still alive. Badly injured with a metal rod lodged in his abdomen, he struggles to his feet and drags himself back to the base camp the crew had set up earlier. There, in excruciating pain, he removes the rod and begins to assess his situation. The reality hits him hard. He is stranded on Mars with no way to contact NASA or his crew, and no spaceship to leave the planet. Worse, he knows that the next scheduled mission won't arrive for another 4 years, and his food supplies are nowhere near enough to last that long. Mark realizes that if he doesn't take action, he won't survive. With his knowledge as a botanist, he decides to attempt the impossible, grow his own food on Mars. Using a few leftover potatoes as seeds, he sets out to create a sustainable food source. But the biggest challenge is water. Mars has none, and the limited supply the astronauts had brought was only enough to survive for a short period. Drawing on his scientific expertise, Mark comes up with a dangerous plan: generate water by combining hydrogen and oxygen. His first experiment, however, goes terribly wrong, ending in a violent explosion. Mark soon realizes that his earlier mistake was not accounting for the oxygen he was breathing inside the habitat. On his next attempt, after carefully measuring the oxygen levels, his experiment finally succeeds. He is able to produce water. Using this breakthrough, Mark waters the soil where he planted his potatoes. Days pass, and to his relief, the tiny plants begin to sprout. For the first time since being stranded, he feels genuine hope. Watching life grow in the barren soil of Mars gives him the will to keep fighting for survival. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the world has already declared Mark dead. His funeral is held, and his crew mourns his loss. But at NASA, a young mission planner carefully studies recent satellite images of the Mars base. She notices something unusual: the solar panels and equipment appear to have been moved. Realizing that only a living person could have done this, she brings her discovery to her superiors. They are stunned. Mark Watney is alive. Still, they face a harsh reality. Even if they launch a rescue mission immediately, Mark would likely starve long before help could ever reach him. But Mark is not the type to sit and wait for death. Instead of despairing, he focuses on a new goal. He remembers that in 4 years, NASA plans to send another mission to a landing site far away from his camp. To survive, he must reach that location, which is nearly 2,500 kilometers across the Martian desert. His solar-powered rover can only travel about 35 kilometers at a time before recharging, making the journey incredibly difficult. Still, it is his only chance. On Earth, NASA debates their options. They decide to build and launch a supply probe filled with food and water, though it will take at least a year to arrive. Fortunately, Mark's potato farm has already expanded, giving him a temporary food supply. But he knows even that won't last forever. Desperate to establish communication, he searches for equipment left from past missions. Eventually, he finds an old camera designed to send images back to Earth. Setting it up, he positions boards to signal messages, hoping NASA will notice and respond. Mark fashions a simple message board and writes a question in the center: "Can you see me?" He labels the left panel no and the right panel yes. When NASA studies the images, they nudge the Pathfinder camera to point at yes, and Mark is overwhelmed with relief. Someone knows he's alive. From then on he begins to communicate with Earth through simple signals and symbols, and NASA confirms they're preparing a food supply for him. Mark asks if his crewmates were told. NASA admits they have not yet contacted them. His crewmates are devastated when they learn the truth, that they left Mark behind. Tragedy follows. One night an unexplained explosion destroys much of Mark's potato crop, wiping out the harvest he had counted on. Already rationing carefully, he now reduces his daily intake even further to stretch what remains. On Earth, NASA scrambles to help and launches a supply rocket loaded with essentials, but heartbreakingly the booster blows up on launch, another lifeline lost. Still, Mark refuses to give in. He sends a defiant message back to Earth: he will fight to survive, and if he dies, he wants his parents to know he died doing what he loved. As NASA explores alternative rescue plans, they seek international help. China volunteers assistance. A man proposes a bold idea: redirect an upcoming spacecraft bound for Earth back toward Mars, or use the already orbiting craft to alter course and rescue Mark sooner. The agency begins weighing these desperate options, racing against time while Mark keeps surviving day by day, stubborn and resourceful. The astronauts face an impossible choice. Returning to Mars to rescue Mark would mean risking their own lives after already spending 19 months in space. NASA deems the plan too dangerous and forbids the mission, but Mark continues to endure on Mars with unshakable determination. Meanwhile, something unexpected happens. The cruise ship, which had been heading back to Earth, suddenly changes course and begins its return to Mars. NASA is stunned, realizing they never gave the order. The truth is that the young scientist who proposed the rescue plan secretly reached out to the crew, urging them to take matters into their own hands. Mark was their crewmate, and waiting years for another rescue attempt was unthinkable. Though NASA is furious, the Chinese Space Agency steps forward to back the mission, providing crucial support and supplies. They argue that if Mark himself refuses to give up, and his crew is willing to risk everything to save him, then the least they can do is help. Together, NASA and China rally behind the mission, racing to make it possible. When Mark finally learns that his crewmates are coming back for him, he is overcome with relief, but he also knows the final leg of survival will be his most dangerous yet. Their ship doesn't have the fuel to land on Mars, so he must launch himself into orbit to rendezvous with them. Mark begins stripping down his small spacecraft, removing heavy parts to make it lighter and capable of reaching orbit. The modifications leave the craft fragile and unstable, but it is his only chance. Strapped into the stripped-down vessel, Mark launches into space. The cabin is cramped, incomplete, and barely holds life support, leaving him gasping for air. At one point, he even loses consciousness, and both his crewmates and NASA on Earth panic, fearing the worst. Miraculously, he regains his senses, though new problems immediately arise. His craft accelerates too fast, spiraling out of control, and he struggles desperately to stabilize it as his crew races toward him. The entire world watches, holding its breath, praying for Mark and the astronauts who have risked everything to bring him home. Mark grows anxious as his damaged craft races out of control, but he reassures his crew that he won't give up. Determined to survive, he works to stabilize his speed while the astronauts aboard the Hermes make their own sacrifices, discarding sections of their ship to create air pressure that slows him down. The plan works. Mark's craft finally approaches close enough for a daring rescue attempt. The ship's commander ventures out, tethered by a rope, reaching toward Mark with all her strength. But the distance is still too great. Thinking quickly, Mark devises a bold plan. He pierces a hole in his spacesuit, using the rush of escaping air as a makeshift thruster. The sudden pressure propels him through the void, guiding his trajectory toward the commander. At last, their hands meet, but for a terrifying moment he slips away again. In a final desperate effort, she throws him a rope, and Mark manages to grab hold. With the crew's combined strength, they pull him aboard, and the entire ship erupts in relief. Against impossible odds, Mark Watney has been saved. The story ends back on Earth, where Mark begins a new chapter as a teacher, guiding the next generation of astronauts. He shares the lessons his ordeal taught him, that in space, survival comes down to problem solving, determination, and above all, never losing hope. His journey, once thought impossible, becomes a testament to human resilience. And with that, the incredible tale of the Martian comes to a close. And so, after countless struggles, impossible odds, and near-death experiences, Mark Watney finally makes it back to his crew and returns safely to Earth. His journey stands as a powerful reminder of resilience, courage, and the strength of the human spirit. Mark proves that no matter how dear the circumstances, there is always a way forward if you refuse to give up. The Martian is not just a tale of survival on another planet, it's a story about hope, perseverance, and the unbreakable bond of humanity that reaches across the stars.